Hi guys, this is Joy from Cordilla Technologies Bangalore, and recently we just hit 1,000 subscribers. Yay! And I really want to say thanks a lot. So all your love and your support was like the thing which made us achieve this subscribers. So here's to 1,000 subscribers more. And I really like that you guys saw our tutorials, and the main motto why we started the whole series was to get to, teach the developers the basics so that they can carry on and we can guide them towards being better Magento developers as a whole. So this video is sort of a special video, so I won't bore you with my endless Gyan. So Gyan is Hindi for knowledge, by the way. In this video, we have a special guest with us on our left side of the screen, as you can see. So some of you might have seen him in the Meet Magento Mumbai, which has happened last month. And some of you might be following him in Twitter and LinkedIn as well. For the others, let me just introduce him. So he is a Magento master, I think for 3 years in a row.
Yep, that's correct.
And even more interesting than that, he is the owner of Buka, which if you don't know, you must. And also he is the guy I met in Meet Magento Mumbai. So here's JC Reitsma.
Yeah, hooray. So thanks for having me, Joy. So yeah, we met up with each other, I think, at Meet Magento India already a couple of times, and then we had interesting discussions on PWA and headless.
Really
and yeah, it's actually I'm happy to actually be on this show as well to see like what can we discuss on the PWA part. So happy to be here.
Exactly. So basically, this was the one of the reasons why I wanted you to talk rather than me talking, because PWA is something which I had heard about like 3 years ago, and I know that it's something which allows you to do offline browsing, which sounds like a pretty cool idea, and I just dropped at that. So I didn't think that how can we implement that in a real world e-commerce scenario or any website scenario until we came across the Magento started building the PWA Studio. Then I went into it. So I think you will be the better person to explain that. Like, is there really a need for PWA?
Yeah, so the difficulty also of PWA, before I can answer your question, is basically what does it mean? And it's basically almost like a marketing term that is used a lot of times, but it's basically a term that includes a lot of different concepts, and as soon as you dive into those concepts, it becomes pretty technical pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So for businesses, especially business owners, it's always a little bit harder to understand like what the whole concept of PWA is, and even for like Magento developers like us, it might be a difficult thing to begin with as well. But in short, basically, as you already mentioned it, PWA is basically that within a web page in general, JavaScript plays a greater role. And to really put it into more dummy terms, in the past, we always built a web page by introducing HTML. This HTML is understood by the browser, and then on top of it, we add CSS and JavaScript. And the best thing to explain about, or the best way to explain PWA would be to say that instead of actually the HTML document being the starting point, it's actually JavaScript being the starting point.
Right.
And there actually, from then on, there's a couple of technical things that we could discuss. And that's really towards developers. However, for the businesses, then there's a couple of added values, and that's basically your question. For instance, one of the things is performance. And I always start there and I always end there, because for businesses, having a fast Magento shop is basically really, really important. And thanks to this new architecture, thanks to that JavaScript is basically the base point, the base of the whole application, a lot of tricks can be added, and they're all about performance. So that's good. Plus, there's a couple of other, benefits, like with React and Vue, but that's more, I think, into the details for developers. But on the long term, you could also say that, hey, if the developers are happy with coding, And if the developers are able to build more advanced features in less time, and that's basically one of the main points about React and Vue, then on the long term, it's also saving money for the businesses.
So it's basically like the developer's learning curve is less, and to develop a new thing, like the actual time which is required if we use tools like React and Vue would be lesser than the traditional approach. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. However, it's a difficult point to always make because at the first, for business owners, PWA will be a new term. To developers, it will be a new technology. And every time when we talk about a new technology, it takes time to adapt. There's a learning curve. There's time that we need to actually dive into the technology and understand it before making it a success.
Yes.
So with React and Vue, as soon as a PHP developer with Magento looks at React code or Vue code, there's always like the moment where the developer is basically really afraid and saying like, oh, I can't do this.
Yes.
But then there's a promise to make, and that's what I'm always trying to focus upon. As soon as you dive into React and you dive into Vue on the long term, it becomes really, really easy. And I'm always trying to demonstrate that with coding samples and etc. But it's really a promise that I've seen come true with developers over time. And
Yes.
therefore, again, if the developers over time become more efficient in what they're building, producing more features in less time, then on the long term, it's a really smart solution as well for business owners because it's saving money.
No, I think one of the things is the way the frameworks like React and Vue are implemented, that the reusability increases. Even if you don't want it to, still the component system is there. So reusability anyway increases.
Yeah,
so that's something we don't have to worry about being a developer.
Exactly, but the devil is in the details, and that's the difficult thing with PWA. So PWA is a marketing term, so that's how I started. But it's a marketing term to describe something else, and that something else is basically all of those features that come with it. But per feature, you basically need to discuss, hey, but what is the benefit? What is the added value? How difficult is it? And that's basically the difficulty that we have. So I believe PWA is the future. However, it's just depending on what kind of features do we need, how easy do we find it to implement it, and that's basically determining how easy is it actually for businesses to get started with it. But then still, it's the future, which points basically to another part. If there's a future, there's a present as well, and there's a past. And the Magento 2 front end that we've used for the last 5 years, so that's basically technically speaking, it's PHTML, XML layout, block classes, and etc. Or less technically speaking, it's the Luma demo. That's something of the past. And there's a couple of things within the PWA feature set, like performance, like ease of use, and that's simply not true with the old front end. And the more you realize it, the more you know that, well, there might not be a business need for it today, but maybe tomorrow or the day after tomorrow or 1 year from now. But sooner or later,
to adapt it as soon as possible so that we'll be ahead of the race, probably.
Well, so that's one of the questions, of course. Do you want to be an early adapter? Do you want to be a late adapter? Do you want to be like the mainstream? But sooner or later, there needs to be some kind of choice to be made. And I can predict basically that the old strategy of Magento with its front-end technology is outdated, and it's going to be replaced with PWA sooner or later.
All right. So one thing which I had a confusion for a long time, and which is that since you said that the entire PWA is not actually rendered starting from the HTML, it starts from the JavaScript. So everything is rendered by your browser, right? So how does that impact SEO?
Yeah, well, that's basically a technical question. So first of all, the direct answer is, well, what is SEO? It's basically trying to satisfy all of those search engines so that they give a higher rating. And then of all of the search engines, it's depending a little bit on the continent where you're in. So in Europe and the US, you could say that Google is simply the big winner. So Google search is the main reason why you want to do SEO. In other continents, so Asia, I think Baidu or Yandex are also popular. And then there's Bing, and then there's so many different search engines
Yes.
out there. And in general, you could say that technologies like React and Vue and Angular have become already so popular that there's almost like a requirement for a search engine to support it. And that was always like a big question. But a year ago, or well, some time ago, Google announced basically that their own Google search bots was supporting React. So if you're building a shop in React, that leads to the quick conclusion that you don't need to do anything for SEO. Simply switching to React is already good enough. But that's a simple answer, and simple answers are never correct in IT business.
Yes, so I'll go a little bit into the technical side. So things like, React and Angular support server-side rendering. I think even Vue supports server-side rendering. So that might make the initial load slower, but the initial snapshot would be rendered so that the search engines find it easier. So which one should I go for? Should I just not worry about it at all, since like you said, Google already supports the single page apps?
Well, so I'm mentioning Google specifically because the news about the other search engines and whether they correctly support React is actually more confusing. And because of this, you could say that, well, theoretically, you're only aiming for SEO for Google, but then you're missing out. And likewise, well, you've already mentioned server-side rendering, and there's actually a lot of features within server-side rendering that are important as well. And for instance, it's the rating again. So SEO simply means like, hey, does a search engine have issues with actually interpreting my site? And then if you're sending in a JavaScript blob, as in with React not optimized with server-side rendering, then the search engine is forced to actually do that JavaScript engine rendering. But if you're supplying the HTML as a blob ready to go for that search engine, like created with server-side rendering, then you're making it easier for the search engine. And if you're making it easier for the search engine, you're actually also making it easier for mobile clients, browsers with a disability, or for people with a disability. So that there's a lot of actually niche areas where actually server-side rendering still has a benefit. And because Google still tries to take in all of those niche areas as well in the ranking of your site, the end conclusion is still that server-side rendering is a must, especially when it deals with e-commerce, because with building shops, we talk about hard dollars. If you're not in the first 10 pages of Google, but in the second 10. So you're trying to be on the top, and you're trying to do everything that you need to do to get higher in the ranking, and that suddenly includes server-side rendering anyway.
All right.
So is it bad for SEO? Well, it's a more difficult question, but if you want to have the best results, the end conclusion is always server-side rendering.
Use server-side rendering.
Yep.
All right.
Yeah.
So coming to the next point, don't mind me, I'm just reading from my trusted little.
Oh yeah.
I have a list of points ready for you. And you can also ask me questions. It's not like an interview, it's like a discussion.
No, yeah, more like a conversation.
We'll probably cut out the parts where I can't answer so that people can. All right. So how is PWA being used today? So like you said, it's not a very new concept, but people are slowly starting to adapt to it. So currently, like if you can give some case studies or something which you have come across, how PWA is being used to the fullest. So
yeah. Well, so to me, the interesting thing about this whole PWA revolution, more or less, is that things are on the move. And actually, earlier or 1 month ago, I was at Meet Magento Mumbai. Before that, I was on a holiday in Thailand. And because of that, actually, I was missing out on the whole movement because so many things happened in between. And that also means that it's more difficult to answer like, hey, what is the current situation today? Do you literally mean today, like this minute or this week or this month? Or and that's the difficulty.
So no, the thing which I'm trying to say is that if I adapt PWA today,
Yeah,
what can I do with it? So
yeah, for sure.
is there any showcase which I can see to understand, okay, this is possible. So I know there are tools like View Storefront and Scandi which show a proper which what I can do with the power of PWA.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
sort of like that. So if I try to adapt PWA, so where can I start? What can I see as a reference?
Yeah, the good thing about the current market is that Magento is not the only player, but there's multiple other players in the same field. And you mentioned Scandi and View Storefront, and there's other players as well that are worth mentioning, like Deity. There's Front Commerce. So there's multiple solutions out there, and I believe actually that there's more solutions coming up. And therefore, actually, there's a lot of competition between these companies as well. And it's not that I can say out loud like this is the web page that you can look at to see like a geography of all of the PWA sites out there. However, what I could say is basically that all of those players on the market now suddenly realize that they really can convince customers to swap to their solution by showing the numbers and by showing actually real cases. So that's a good thing, and that's basically totally different from half a year ago, because half a year ago it was still like an experimental phase. There were only a few websites out there, and I could literally say that currently within the Magento ecosystem, there's over 100 easily. 100 cases of PWA sites that are actually mentioned in listings of Magento PWA sites or View Storefront PWA sites or Scandi PWA sites. So all of those competitors are just eager to just promote whatever has been built with their own product. So that's maybe part of the question, and I'm not able to answer it completely because I'm not a walking.
Probably what we'll do is at the end of the video, I'll probably research a little bit and we'll give the links so that the people watching the video can also, so it
exactly,
basically comes down to your preference, right? So you can look at a website and you can say, oh, this is exactly what I wanted. So I can just.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and maybe it is worth actually to mention also that if we're looking at the current state of all of those PWA use cases, you could say that actually those use cases are based maybe upon the technology of a couple of months ago, because if it's a use case today, it was built actually in the last couple of months. But there's also a couple of use cases of half a year ago, or even a couple of use cases of a year ago. And if you try to sum up like the differences between all of those use cases, the first point that is most important to actually make that use case worth it is performance. And you can see a lot of variety in there. So it's kind of difficult also to sum up like what are the best use cases without looking at the technology itself. So the use cases for View Storefront might be very different from PWA Studio. It's depending on the size of the catalog. But in general, what I find interesting to see is that half a year ago or 1 year ago, it was really difficult already to focus upon that performance part, because server-side rendering was also really difficult to build. And either companies back then made it a success story to actually build something from scratch, because they had very experienced Vue and React developers in duty, and that they already knew everything there was to learn, and they made it a success. While if you look at the PWA Studio use cases or View Storefront or Scandi, then actually I think a lot of those older use cases are showing that it might not always be best practice, because those best practices also need to evolve. What I find really interesting is that the use cases of PWA Studio sites nowadays or View Storefront sites nowadays are showing basically how it should be done, performance-wise, and then also more interestingly adding features slowly one by one. And then we're actually talking about the features, because that's like diving into the details slowly. The features might be push notifications, geolocation, basically making use of the capabilities of the browser.
Right.
And the browser is just progressing a lot with like advanced features added by Google to the Chrome browser on a daily basis. And there's a lot of APIs within JavaScript still yet to be unveiled. But the PWA technology is there to actually keep track of that. So that's the benefit.
So it's sort of an ever-evolving ecosystem, you can say. So we
it's
should
and therefore we talk about the PWA. It's a terminology, it's a marketing phrase, but it's also an abbreviation. It's a progressive web app. So as soon as the web app architecture is correct, you can progressively add new features to it. But I think like a couple of those use cases of today are simply focused upon getting that web app in there. So making the first step to at least make the switch from the old school Magento to the new school Magento, while they didn't worry about the progressive part yet. Because first you want to have the product just working, and then you can progressively add more features to it. But to my mind, that's where we are at the current point. We're at the brink of actually having that many PWA sites, so that there's also a lot to learn from those PWA sites. So the best practices are evolving, but also a lot of the existing PWA sites are moving into the next milestone, leading into new features, and that's the real progressiveness, basically.
Right. So one thing which I found really interesting is that, like you said, a year back, like barely anyone talked about PWA. I'm sure people did, but I didn't hear it. But then suddenly it was like a PWA boom. I mean, everyone is like, let's use PWA, let's go with it. It's like the shiny new thing of the future or something. So what do you think? What do you think brought that or triggered that chain reaction in the Magento community?
Yeah. Me. No, well, literally, I've seen myself actually shouting out so much about PWA and headless. So, but it's maybe theoretically guys like me promoting all of that stuff, and of course for a reason, because I'm simply convinced that actually by making that shift, making that swap into a headless development, working with React and Vue. So I'm personally working with React and Vue on a daily basis as well, and I enjoy it so much. And then if I look back at the Magento 2 front-end technology, I think like, oh my God, what a difference.
Yes, so this has happened to me as well. Like from a developer's perspective, once you see how this React and Vue is using JavaScript to make the front-end, it makes sense. It makes sense that front-end should be made in this way. So at that time, the traditional sense of PHP actually rendering the front end and sending it to the browser, that sort of seems like a deprecated system to me.
Yeah. And the more you use the new stuff, the more you dislike the old stuff. And that's not naturally Magento to blame, but that's also like how technology evolves and how we move forward in general. Right. But it's interesting to see basically that there's kind of like a curve in the adaptation as well. So it started, so you heard about it like 1 year ago. I started working with React about 3 years ago. And then I just played around with it and I found it fun, but I didn't see the relationship with Magento itself. But then I think like 2.5 years ago, suddenly Magento started talking about it, but it was also that the competitors, so mainly Vue Storefront and Deity, came up and basically started offering their own technology towards others, and that started a hype. It started also a phase for basically an experimental phase where those companies were offering something for those developers that were eager to play with a code base that was buggy, not working always, strange issues, but at least there was something to experiment with. Right. Then came the early adapters, and the early adapter phase is slowly now moving into something that Magento in the past called the early mainstream, or I'm not sure like what kind of terminology they used, but to identify that we're slowly picking up on that curve, that PWA becomes no longer something for the early adapters, but basically for everyone who's willing to take that leap now. And still that is growing because, well, there's a huge Magento 1 community still, Magento 2 community. And the expectation is basically that on the long run, everybody will using PWA-like features. So yeah, it's again that change that is happening on a daily basis, that it's making it interesting. We don't know where it's going to be ending up with, but we see that things are slowly picking up.
Right. So now let's come to a little bit technical for our developers out there.
Yay!
So I am a developer. I am using Magento for a long time. I'm very confident with XML, the HTML, and the layout block and template system basically. And now suddenly you're throwing PWA to me. So how do I start? So basically, it's a change of technology completely, right? So any tips for our developers? How do I do it? How do I begin?
So the first problem is basically that if you're diving into PWA, there's always like a lot of buzzwords actually thrown at you. So headless PWA are the first buzzwords, but then we have push notifications and we have geolocation and payment API and etc. So there's a lot of features that you should familiarize yourself with. And interestingly enough, all of those features are still located in the browser because we're talking about JavaScript.
Yeah.
So theoretically, this belongs to the field of front-end developers. I disagree with that a little bit. A backend developer, if a backend developer is only busy with ERP systems and technical integrations and writing unit tests and integration tests or whatever, then it's a true backend developer. But I think often in companies, a backend developer also is there to support the front-end developer. So a backend developer has more abstract knowledge of understanding things, meaning also that a backend developer, its job is maybe to develop block classes, view model classes, dealing with controllers, making it possible for a front-end developer to use simple front-end technology, working within the PHTML, basically.
Yeah, that's what I believe, that being a backend developer, if you have zero idea of how the front end works, then your backend logic would also not suit the front end properly. It won't be efficient. And the same thing goes for front-end developers as well. So if I'm taking let's say if I'm rendering a product page, for example, if I know how the product, so if I have a little bit of idea about models and how the EAV works and how I can create attributes in Magento, it will help me make the product page better, probably.
Yeah. So and that's my first answer basically to your question, like, hey, where should we start? And it's basically this introduction of terms, PWA, and all of the stuff that comes with it. However, it shouldn't be only the backend, shouldn't be only the front-end developers learning about that, but it should be also the backend developers. That's the first phase.
Okay.
Well, the second phase is JavaScript, because Magento 2, the original front-end, is written in Knockout and require a little bit of jQuery, but then actually on top of it, a huge layer of JavaScript written by Magento itself. And to be honest, if we talk about the complexity of Magento and the checkout and things like that, it's actually not due to jQuery or Knockout or require. It's often actually due to this additional layer of Magento itself.
The nightmare of UI components.
And it's the nightmare of UI components. And it's maybe also showing that back then, when the architectural choices were made, Magento was not the best, or the developers that created all of that were not the best JavaScript architects. And that's something I always repeat, because it sounds almost as if I'm attacking Magento, but it's not. It's more or less pointing out even Magento core developers are humans. So you can quote me on that. But and those humans are making mistakes. And one of the mistakes was basically that a lot of backend developers were asked to dive into the front end to create basically the JavaScript architecture for the checkout. However, they were yet to become more senior developers in that JavaScript area, and that's like where the flaws actually came from. And if we start learning from those mistakes that Magento made over like 8 years ago, the early steps into Magento 2, we can learn from it. and that's basically that same story. Instead of just having a couple of developers learn about JavaScript, it would be wise actually if the Magento backend developers also learn a little bit about JavaScript as well.
So start with JavaScript and then slowly pick up on. So the core JavaScript knowledge should be proper to start with.
So it starts with the PWA terminology, then JavaScript in general, and then we're talking about technical things like making sure that everybody is on board with promises, the new ES6 Plus standard, so all of the new ways of writing things, including arrow functions.
Yeah.
Because then that's slowly diving into Node as well, and Node is actually somebody like well, theoretically it could be a lot more, but I would say that at first it's basically learning about all of the command line stuff out there, and that's suddenly introducing tools like Babel, Webpack, and then you're actually only one step away from Vue and React because that's actually where PWA really kicks off.
Yeah, for me, Node.js personally, the hardest thing to wrap my mind around was that I can run JavaScript without a browser.
Yeah. And that's funny to hear, but that's actually one of the common scenarios that we should be seeing in the Magento ecosystem a lot. That instead of just having a PWA maybe written in Node, but then actually you use a tool like Webpack and Babel to transpile it into normal JavaScript that runs in the browser. But additionally, we could also run still Node, and we're doing so already by using Gulp and Grunt and etc. But then actually the additional step would be maybe that between the browser and Magento itself, there's actually a middleware layer, an additional server written in Node. And basically, we've been talking about SEO just a while back, and SEO leads into server-side rendering. And that's actually where server-based Node actually comes in as well. Server-side rendering, to my opinion or to my knowledge, actually is impossible without Node on the server.
Right.
And that's basically showing also that something that starts with JavaScript actually is installed on the server, and then suddenly it becomes the property again of the backend developer, of maybe the DevOps guy, and etc. And that's why the first steps into PWA are most useful to be taken as a team as a whole. So all of the backend developers, front-end developers, DevOps, learning about those aspects.
Right. So I'll ask you a question which probably many people have asked you, and you would probably say it depends. So anything other than it depends would be helpful for me. So should I go with Vue, React, or Angular?
So it depends. However, I can also say a couple of things, but then as soon as I'm saying that, I would be biased. So make sure that my words are only like my personal opinion.
That's what I want to hear. What's your personal opinion in this?
Yeah. So a lot of times, actually, if you hear that JavaScript developers have been active already for the last 10 years or so, then the more experienced developers are actually people that have experience with Angular as well. So therefore, it makes sense actually to include Angular in this listing of 3, so Vue, React, and Angular. However, to my opinion, Angular is outdated. Angular is a nice way to get started. Well, earlier it was the only way, or one of the only ways, to get started with JavaScript in a more application-like, app-like, PWA-like thing. But nowadays we have Vue and React, and those two are simply much more popular than Angular for various reasons. But I think the most important reason would be it's easier to dive into those other two than Angular. Plus, with Angular, you need a lot of modifications of the API to make it work. So therefore, we would be modifying Magento for the sake of Angular. And that simply feels a little bit weird. Vue and React simply are tools that you can adapt Magento to. And then in Magento, we've got a GraphQL API, and that works perfectly fine with Vue or React. So that's basically my personal opinion already. Like, let's not talk about Angular anymore.
Yeah. All right. So community-wise, like the Vue and React-wise, which one do you think is a more mature and more stable community?
Well, and this is a difficult one. Also because Vue and React are both progressing pretty quickly right now. So React has introduced actually a feature called hooks in the last year, and suddenly the whole React community and a lot of open source projects have been switching from an old code base into a new code base thanks to hooks.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to explain like hooks because that's a little bit in depth. But it's basically
keep that for another video.
Yeah, theoretically, yeah.
Yeah.
But now the interesting thing is that Vue 3 is coming up, and basically in Vue 3, one of the most hyped features is a so-called composition API. But the composition API is doing the same thing as hooks. So you can see that whenever React has a really cool feature, then Vue will borrow it. And I believe currently in Vue 3, there's a couple of exciting features coming up that will also be borrowed in React in upcoming versions as well. So they're competing, and that competition is just a fun little thing to see, so that it's not about the features anymore. And that's the interesting thing. Because if it's not about the features, you could say that it's about the performance. Well, they're equal or almost equal in performance. And we could say that it's not, but that's like nitpicking, and then we're diving into the details too much. But I believe that they're more or less equal. And then actually the most important part would be, hey, but how difficult is it to get started with React or Vue? And that's basically where the whole discussion normally ends. So which one is easier to use, Vue or React? And out of the box, Vue is easier. And this is also showing why Vue has a high adaptation rate in a lot of other projects, so that new developers that are new to the whole Node JavaScript architecture are quite, they can quite easily embrace this whole Vue system easily. With React, it's a little bit more difficult, and that seems like a downside, but it's also based on how do you want to learn new technology. And the funny thing is with Vue, the things are becoming easy. Yeah, so let's continue.
All right, so I think that pretty much covers up all of the topics which basically someone who is new to PWA, who is just starting out with PWA will, have. Right. So I think that should serve as sort of a starting point for the people who are watching this video, so that they can adapt PWA more and,
cool.
like,
yeah,
they can start using the technologies and advance the ecosystem of PWA.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, and maybe like one final mentioning also of like how to get started. We mentioned basically like there's the starting point of learning the terminology. Understanding like what all of those PWA features is about. Then there's JavaScript, then there's Node, and then there's this choice between React and Vue.
Yeah.
But more into details, there's actually also the big question, and that's I think like almost the hardest question, where to start actually building a PWA for Magento. Because then theoretically you could build something from scratch. But if you're choosing React, there's a different choice to be made regarding like, hey, if I want to reuse somebody else's functionality, then with Vue. So more practically, we talked about the companies that are offering solutions, PWA solutions for developers. And I always refer to them as PWA providers. So they're providing a PWA architecture so that front-end developers are able to modify it. And with Vue, it seems that almost the only competitor within Magento, it's still Vue Storefront. And with React, it's Magento with its own Magento PWA Studio. Then there's Deity, and then there's Scandi, and then there's multiple others as well. Meaning also that basically by choosing for either React or for Vue, you might also be choosing for one of those PWA providers.
Right.
And then comes back another question that you also were raising. Hey, but what kind of community is behind it? And it's not only about your own personal learning skills, but it's also basically what kind of community can you lean upon? Well, and that discussion is far too difficult. So I'm still unable to point out like, hey, the Magento community is totally different from the Vue Storefront community, and these are the benefits, because it's again like, how are you personally fitting in? And normally what I always say is basically that there's a lot of choices to make. However, the most fundamental choice that you need to make is also what feels good. So if you're reading about Vue and you like it, and then you read about React and you don't like it, and then you dive further into the Vue storefront as a result, if that feels good, go with it. And often what I say is, whatever choice you make, don't worry. It's only a front end. It's only Vue or React. And if you want to change,
at the end, it's just one JS file and one CSS file.
Theoretically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, most of the times, things like these Magento PWA providers are not separate entities. So it's like if one comes up with some innovation, that will be used in the entire community, right? So at the end result is the entire community is growing, the Magento PWA community, if you think about it.
Yeah, and that's the interesting part. I see also a little bit of a movement within React. There's multiple ways to get started with your own app, and there's also a couple of frameworks built on top of React to easily build a blog or something else. And for blogs, a very popular solution is Gatsby. However, for more advanced purposes, so really building an app with advanced features like e-commerce, it seems that Next.js is a more popular approach. So a lot of the people or a lot of the developers that have chosen for React, I hear them talking about, hey, but if we're going to build a React app connecting to Magento, wouldn't it be a really good idea to actually introduce Next, as in the building blocks for pagination, for routing, for server-side rendering even, so that we have another framework taking care of all of those parts, and we only need to build on top of it the Magento logic. And interestingly, in Vue, there's the same kind of stuff. So there's more simple tools that allow you to build your own blog. But then more advanced technologies, then you end up with Nuxt. So Nuxt and Next, it's not a coincidence that those two names are more or less related.
Yeah.
An interesting thing then is Vue Storefront is currently rewriting their code base and quickly doing so, introducing basically Vue Storefront Next, and now Vue Storefront Next is also based upon Nuxt. So it more or less seems that within React and within Vue there's popular approaches, and then within Magento we're following those popular approaches as well.
Right. So, anything you would like to share with our the people who are watching this video today?
Well, so first of all, I know Hindi, so I can say out loud like "Tumse milka acha laga."
Oh my God, that's awesome.
I hope like the pronunciation is okay.
No, your accent is like, it doesn't feel like someone who doesn't know Hindi speaking. So words like, you said acha. So acha, that cha is a really difficult thing to pronounce for someone who doesn't speak the dialect, But you said acha almost perfectly.
Yeah, well, thank you. So I've actually been to India multiple times. So I enjoyed meeting up with you also in Mumbai a month ago, and before that I knew a couple of words. So Dhanyavad, Namaskar, Ek do tin char panch, and etc. I forgot a lot of things, but it's nice to know this little phrase as well. Awesome.
Nice. So even I am visiting Netherlands this May, probably.
Yeah.
So
cool.
Hopefully we'll meet.
Hopefully we meet up. Yeah. Awesome. Let me know. Yeah.
All right. Of course. So thanks a lot, guys, and thanks a lot, Jesse. So please,
thank you.
Please like and subscribe if you like this video. Like I say always, so that I can continue making more videos. So it's not like I won't make videos if you don't like and subscribe, but please like and subscribe. So thank you, Jesse, again.
And thank you.
It's been awesome talking to you. Bye-bye.
See you.